Okay, today we're going to look at a summary of unfair dismissal, and we're going to find out a little bit at the start about how we can spot what is potentially an unfair dismissal so we can actually avoid making an unfair dismissal. Now, the best way to think through this is, item one is whether the dismissal is unfair or not. And the best way to think your way through this is to think that every dismissal is unfair in an employment such situation unless it's within one of the 5 acceptable reasons for dismissal, and unless, secondly, the tribunal is going to think at a later date that it was a reasonable response for the employer to dismiss in those circumstances. So that's the first point to bear in mind. A dismissal is unfair unless, 1, it's in one of the 5 reasons, 2, it's reasonable to dismiss in those circumstances. Right, the second point to consider is that unfair dismissal only applies to employees. Who are employees? Well, it might seem fairly obvious. They're the people who are all obviously employees, but they could also include employees who are not within the jurisdiction unless that's within England and Wales. They're not working in England and Wales unless they have a sufficient connection with England and Wales, and then they might become employees within the jurisdiction. The employee has to have 2 years in most circumstances, not always. So the employee has to have 2 years continuous employment unless it's an automatically unfair dismissal, or unless it's for medical suspension or reserve forces, which I'm not going to deal with, it's a bit technical, or unless the employee is dismissed because of their political opinions or affiliations. And the next point is to decide whether there's been a dismissal or not. A dismissal has to be a termination by the employer. Now that termination could be because the employer has fired the employee, situation 1. Situation 2, that termination could be because the employee's come to the end of a fixed term contract and the employer hasn't renewed. And situation 3, which you've probably heard of a lot, and which I'll discuss in some more detail in a later video, is constructive unfair dismissal. That's where the employer has allegedly repudiated the contract of the employee, and I'll go into that in a bit more detail later on. So it's where the employer has done some act or taken some steps which indicates that it no longer feels that it's bound by the employment contract. So, for example, there's one instance where the employer kept asking the employee, who was a lorry driver, to run the Calais route when every time the ports were closed.